18% of U.S. households are millionaires by net worth. Roughly 20% of Americans save more than 15% of their gross income. 27% have 6 months of essential expenses in liquid emergency savings. These are percentile data from the Fed, the BLS, and Bankrate, and they describe something most people don't notice. The bar to be in the top 10 or 20% of any given financial metric in America is much lower than the marketing around it makes it sound. Most of the habits that put you in the top 1% of financial outcomes aren't exotic. They're a specific set of about 10 ordinary moves that almost nobody is doing all of, but that anyone could do. Today, 10 habits. Each one comes with a verified percentile threshold from a primary data source. If you do 5 of them, you're already top 10% on at least one metric. If you do all 10, the math puts you in roughly the top 1% of US households on overall financial discipline. A note before we start. The percentile data in this video comes from the multiple resources including Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances 2022, Vanguard's How America Saves 2026 report released June 2026, the New York Fed Q4 225 Household Debt and Credit Report, and Census ACS 2024. None of it is from a marketing brochure or a personal finance influencer's estimate. The point of this video isn't to motivate you, it's to give you a diagnostic readout. Top percentile rankings aren't aspirational goals, they're the math output of specific behaviors. Most people doing these habits aren't aware they're already in the top percentile. Most people not doing them aren't aware how few habits actually separate them from there. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance for normal people. The kind that actually works instead of the kind that sells you a course. No motivational fluff, no fantasy returns, just what the math actually does over time. If that's what you're here for, hit subscribe. Today, 10 habits, each anchored to a verified percentile from Fed, BLS, or census data and what they tell you about where you actually rank in the US financial distribution. Habit 1. Net worth above $1 million. This puts you in the top 18% of US households per the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances 2022. The most recent comprehensive survey, median household net worth is $192,000. Top 10% threshold is $1.9 million. Top 1% threshold is over $13 million. $1 million in net worth sounds high until you look at how it gets accumulated. For most households reaching this threshold, the biggest single asset is home equity. Second biggest, retirement accounts. Third, if present at all, taxable investments outside of those. Most millionaire households didn't reach the number through one giant move. They reached it through consistent retirement contributions plus paying down a mortgage plus modest market gains over 20 or 30 years. The relevant insight isn't that 1 million is achievable for everyone. It isn't. Median household income, savings discipline, and geography all matter. But the threshold itself is much lower than the cultural narrative around it suggests. The image of a millionaire as exotic is decades out of date. Roughly 1 in 5 US households is already there. If you're in your 50s with a paid-off house worth $400,000, a 6-figure retirement account, and modest taxable investments, the math may have already placed you in the top 18%. The diagnostic question is whether you've added up your actual numbers recently. Most people in the top quartile of wealth don't realize they're there because they haven't done the simple addition. Habit 2. Any tax-advantaged retirement account with a balance. This puts you in roughly the top 46% of US households. Per the Fed SCF 2022, 54% of households have a retirement account of any type, which means 46% have none at all. Among those who do have one, the median balance is around $87,000. Mean balances run much higher, dragged up by accounts at the top tier. To clear the bottom half on this metric, you don't need a specific balance. You don't need a specific contribution rate. You just need the account to exist. If you currently work somewhere with a 401k and you're contributing even a single dollar of your salary into it, you've already moved past 46% of Americans on this single metric. For people in their 50s or older without any retirement account, the practical step is opening one. An IRA at any major brokerage takes about 15 minutes. The 2026 contribution limit is $7,500 for those under 50. $8,600 at 50 and older with the catch-up. Whether the dollar amount you can contribute is large doesn't matter as much as the fact that the account exists. The existence is the threshold. Habit 3. Saving more than 15% of gross income. This puts you in roughly the top 20% of U.S. households. The Bureau of Economic Analysis personal saving rate for Q1 2026 was 3.9%. Historical long-run average since 1959 sits at 8.4%. That pandemic spike to 31.8% in April 2020 was an outlier driven by stimulus checks and lockdown spending constraints, and the rate has been back below 5% since 2022. Against that baseline, saving 15% of gross income is unusual. Vanguard's How America Saves 2026 report shows the average 401k deferral rate among workers is 7.6%, with a median of 6.6%. Only 51% of Vanguard participants hit Vanguard's recommended target rate of 12 to 15% or contributed. At the statutory maximum, up from 47% in 2021, across all sources of saving including outside 401k accounts, achieving 15% of gross requires deliberate behavior across multiple buckets. If you're contributing 15% or more of your gross income across all retirement accounts, HSA, and taxable brokerage combined, the math places you in approximately the top 20% of U.S. savers. The threshold isn't a fixed dollar number, it's a behavior threshold. Someone earning $60,000 who saves $9,000 a year clears the same percentile bar as someone earning $200,000 who saves $30,000. The ratio matters, not the absolute number. Habit 4. Maxing your HSA every year you have access. This puts you in roughly the top 3 to 5% of U.S. adults. The Health Savings Account is the only triple tax advantage single account in the U.S. tax code, with deductible contributions, tax-free growth, and tax-free withdrawals for qualified medical expenses. The 2026 contribution limits are $4,400 for self-only coverage and $8,750 per family. Coverage, plus a $1,000 catch-up at 55 and older. Per Devenir's 2025 year-end HSA research report, the average individual HSA contribution is roughly $1,000 per year against the maximum of $4,400. The average family contribution is $1,500 against $8,750. Most HSA holders are contributing 20 to 25% of what they could. Only about one-third of U.S. adults are enrolled in an HSA-eligible high-deductible health plan to begin with. Of those, only a small fraction max the contribution. That puts the share of U.S. adults who max their HSA every year at roughly 2 to 4% of the total adult population. If you have HSA access and you're maxing every year, you're doing something almost no one else is doing. The advantage compounds tax-free for decades. By the time you reach Medicare at 65, the HSA can serve as a backup retirement account. Since withdrawals after 65 for non-medical purposes are taxed as ordinary income with no penalty, the same as a traditional IRA. Habit 5. $250,000 or more in retirement accounts by age 50. This puts you in roughly the top 25% of 50 to 59-year-olds. According to Vanguard's How America Saves 2026 report, the median retirement account balance for participants aged 55 to 64 is $107,269. Average balance for the same cohort is $305,000. 90th percentile sits around $900,000. Numbers for 50 to 59 are similar but slightly lower across each tier. A balance of $250,000 at 50 puts you somewhere around the 75th percentile of your age cohort. $350,000 pushes you toward the 80th, $500,000 puts you at roughly the 90th. The reason this matters is the compounding runway. A 50-year-old with $250,000 who continues to contribute the catch-up allowed maximum of $32,500 a year at 7% real return ends at about $1.5 million by 65, comfortably above the conventional retirement threshold. A 50-year-old with $30,000 and no realistic capacity to max contributions has a much harder road. The compounding window between 50 and 65 is the same length for everyone in that age range. The starting balance determines what the runway can produce. Habit 6. An emergency fund covering 6 or more months of essential expenses. This puts you in roughly the top 27% of U.S. households. The Bankrate 2026 Emergency Savings Report, polled in December 2025, found that 27% of Americans have enough saved to cover 6 months of expenses. Another 19% can cover 3 to 5 months. 30% have some emergency savings but less than 3 months of coverage. And 24% of Americans have no emergency savings at all. The Federal Reserve Survey of Household Economics and Decision-Making 2024 reaches a directionally similar conclusion. 55% of U.S. adults can cover 3 months of expenses, but the share with 6 months or more is meaningfully smaller. The threshold matters because it's the difference between most ordinary financial emergencies becoming setbacks versus becoming catastrophes. A job loss at 55 becomes a job search rather than a forced retirement. A medical event becomes a temporary expense rather than a portfolio liquidation at the wrong moment. Roof replacement becomes a planned outlay rather than high-interest debt that takes years to clear. If your essential monthly household expenses are $5,000 and you have $30,000 or more in cash or short-term treasuries that you don't touch for other purposes, you're at the 6-month threshold. If your expenses are $7,000 and you have $42,000 or more, same threshold. The dollar amount scales with your spending, not with someone else's number. The diagnostic question is whether you have enough liquid cash that a 6-month income disruption wouldn't force you to sell. Investments at a bad moment. Habit 7. All-in investment cost below 0.5%. This puts you in roughly the top 25% of U.S. investors. The Morningstar 2024 fee study, the most recent annual report, found the asset-weighted average expense ratio across all U.S. mutual funds was 0.36%. The simple average across all funds was higher, around 0.55%, dragged up by expensive active funds with smaller asset bases. Adding typical advisor AUM fees of 1% puts the total all-in cost for most retail investors around 1.3 to 1.5% annually. The investor paying under 0.5% total, fund expenses plus any advisor fees combined, is in approximately the top 25%. Achieving that threshold typically requires holding broad market index funds with expense ratios in the 0.03 to 0.104 to rent range, and either skipping the percentage-based advisor or paying a flat fee planner once a year instead of an AUM percentage. The compounding effect over 30 years is substantial. A $1 million portfolio earning 7% gross, paying 1.3% in fees, ends at about $5.8 million after 30 years. The same portfolio paying 0.010% ends at about $7.3 million. The difference, $1.5 million, is the cost of fees alone over a long enough time frame. If your all-in investment cost is below 0.5%, you've already won an enormous portion of the long-term battle without doing anything that shows up in any monthly statement. The wins on this metric don't show up month to month, they show up at the end. Habit 8. Owning your primary home outright with no mortgage. This puts you in roughly the top 30% of U.S. households, or about half of households aged 65 and older. Per Census ACS 2024 data, about 65% of U.S. households own their home in some form. Of those owners, about 55% still have a mortgage, leaving 45% owning outright. Combined, roughly 30% of all U.S. households are mortgage-free homeowners. For households aged 65 and older, about 79% are owners, and about 64% of those own free and clear, working out to about half of all 65-plus households mortgage-free. The financial significance for the late career or retirement years is substantial. Housing is typically the largest line item in a household budget. Eliminating the principal and interest payment cuts annual expenses by anywhere from $12,000 to $36,000, depending on your former mortgage balance and rate. That reduction is the equivalent of having an additional $300,000 to $900,000 in investment portfolio at a 4% withdrawal rate if you own your home outright at 60 or older. The math has already given you a meaningful boost toward retirement security beyond what your portfolio statement shows. The reverse is also true if you're still carrying a mortgage at 65 or 70. The portfolio number you need to feel secure is higher than it would be if the house were paid. Habit 9. Zero revolving credit card debt. This puts you in roughly the top 40% of US credit card users. According to the New York Fed's reporting on the Q4 2025 household debt and credit data, about 60% of US credit card users carry a balance from one month to the next. The other 40% pay in full each month and avoid interest charges entirely. With around 175 million Americans holding credit cards, that works out to roughly 105 million revolvers and 70 million transactors. The average credit card balance per cardholder is approximately $7,300 per the New York Fed Q4 2025 data. Revolvers carry meaningfully higher balances than that average since transactors pull the denominator down. At the Federal Reserve, G19 reported average APR of around 21% for Q1 2026. An $8,000 revolving balance generates approximately $1,700 a year in interest, paid in exchange for nothing. The threshold here isn't about avoiding credit cards. Used correctly, credit cards offer purchase protection, rewards, and fraud liability shielding that debit cards don't. The threshold is about whether you carry a balance month to month, which means you're paying interest. If you pay your statement balance in full every month, you're in the top 40% of credit card users by behavior alone. For households reaching retirement, this matters because revolving credit card debt is the most expensive consumer debt available. Carrying $20,000 of credit card debt at 21% APR costs $4,200 a year in pure interest, which is the difference between sustainable retirement spending and not for many median income retirees. Habit 10. A written retirement plan with specific numbers. This puts you in roughly the top 15 to 20% of US households. This is the habit that requires the least money to perform and the most thinking. Industry surveys from Fidelity, Schwab, and EBRI consistently find that roughly 15 to 20% of US households have a written retirement plan with concrete numbers attached, a target portfolio size, a planned retirement date, a specific withdrawal rate or strategy, and updated assumptions about Social Security, healthcare, and longevity. Most retirement planning happens in vague form. Retire around 65. Have enough. Figure it out closer to the date. Vague planning rarely produces good outcomes because the math of retirement is mechanical and unforgiving. 4% rule, the Social Security claiming decision, the Roth conversion window, the asset location optimization. None of these get done well in vague form. A written plan does not need to be elaborate. A single sheet of paper with target portfolio size, planned retirement age, withdrawal rate, healthcare bridge plan if retiring before 65, and Social Security claiming age would put you ahead of most US households on this dimension. The act of writing it down forces specificity. Specificity forces actually running the math. Running the math is the difference between hoping and knowing. If you have a written plan with specific numbers that you've updated within the last year, you're top 15% on planning rigor alone. But ranking isn't the goal. Quick acknowledgement before closing this out. The point of going through these 10 habits as percentile rankings isn't to motivate you to chase a number or to feel inadequate if you're not at the top. The percentile is a diagnostic readout, not a target. Most people in the top 5% of US households on net worth don't think of themselves as wealthy because they're looking up at the top 1%. Most people in the top quartile of retirement savings don't feel ahead because they're comparing themselves to colleagues with higher balances. The reference point matters more than the absolute number for how people feel about where they are. Math doesn't care how you feel about it. What I'm doing by structuring this video around the percentiles is short-circuiting one specific assumption. That the people in the top percentiles got there through some exotic move. They didn't. They got there by doing 5 or 6 ordinary things consistently for 20 or 30 years. To be in the top 27% on emergency funds, the threshold is 6 months of expenses, not $1 million in cash. To be in the top 15% on planning rigor, the threshold is a written sheet of paper, not a financial advisor relationship. Percentile data tells you the bar is lower than the cultural narrative makes it sound. That's worth knowing. 10 habits, each tied to a verified percentile from a primary data source. Doing 5 puts you in the top 10% of US households on at least one metric. Doing all 10 puts you in roughly the top 1% of overall financial discipline, even if your absolute dollar numbers don't put you in the top 1% of wealth. Top percentile rankings aren't aspirational goals, they're diagnostic readouts of specific behaviors. The math doesn't care about the marketing, it only cares about whether you actually do the things. Most people not in the top percentiles think they're missing some piece of knowledge or some inheritance or some exotic move. They're not. They're missing the consistency of 5 or 6 ordinary actions repeated for 20 or 30 years. That's the gap. That's all the gap? If this helped, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.